Well, I think Crimean Tatars themselves are best to describe what is going on the ground. I'm not an expert really in that, reading just what everybody's reading from the news. But one of the most disturbing developments is the possible banning of Crimean Tatar Mejlis, which is the representative body of Crimean Tatars, and has been so for many decades, and is not just a representative body in name, but also in deed. And for indigenous peoples, representative bodies have central importance, because those representative bodies, whether they are parliaments or, in case of Crimean Tatars Mejlis, they can be called different names, but they are the main vehicles of realizing human rights of indigenous peoples, including rights to self-determination and others. So if a representative body is being banned, then this is really a hostile act, not just towards that particular organization, in this case again the Mejlis, but it's really an attack against the people, in this case Crimean Tatars. And it's in a way like a negation of existence of this people that has elected its representative body. As such, it is contrary to all possible laws of Ukraine, but also international human rights law and norms, specifically those norms that have been set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which represents the global consensus on the rights of indigenous peoples. Mejlis has not been banned yet. I understand that the hearing on this issue has been planned for March 3rd, but it is something to watch out very seriously. And if indeed the occupying authorities ban Mejlis on some contrived grounds of being an extremist organization or whatever, it doesn't matter, then there will be repercussions.
And could you elaborate on what those repercussions would be?
Well, maybe time will tell, but I won't go to specifics consciously at this point. But in a broader sense, this would lead this would seriously harm Russia's reputation as a guardian of indigenous peoples in general. Now, over the past decades, one must say that Russia has actually been quite active on international venues as a country that presents supposedly good practices concerning Russia's indigenous peoples. In particular, over the past 2 or 3 years, Russia has made a conscious effort to show to the international community and also the community of indigenous peoples that Russia is a good country, a good home for its indigenous peoples.
But this would undo all the good work.
It will completely undo it, and even more. It would really sink Russia's reputation in the sphere of indigenous rights, like to new lows, so to say. It will be noticed by everybody, by the formal UN mechanisms that deal with indigenous peoples. There's the Permanent Forum, the Expert Mechanism, the Special Rapporteur, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, as well as the global family of indigenous peoples. And this really is a community that has a strong sense of solidarity towards its brothers and sisters, so to say. And Crimean Tatars are seen as brothers and sisters.
Of Tatars in other parts of Russia?
No, of indigenous peoples of the world.
Of the world, okay.
Yeah, this is a pretty large community, more than 300 million people, and this community is becoming more and more organized and is able to influence also decision makers in their own countries and the UN system more and more. So the paradox here is that if Russia can violate collective rights of one indigenous people, in this case Crimean Tatars, so brutally, why does it even bother to show this kind of a good face at the United Nations? It's a major contradiction, and it's a contradiction that Russia will not get away with.
And again, I mean, in these treaties that Russia is signatory to, are there any automatic I mean, things that would be triggered by violations, or would there have to be a vote?
Well, no, we're not talking about this kind of like hard sanctions or anything like that, because one should say that the much of the international norms around rights of indigenous peoples is not based on like hard laws, but is more like norms, some of which have become essentially statutory part of statutory human rights law. I think we are talking more about the reputation of Russia, and also about the positions that Russia has internationally when speaking up on indigenous peoples and such.
Sure. So let's talk now about Ukraine. I mean, since the annexation, the Crimean Tatars have retained their political will, their political strength in Ukraine. You know, as a foreign observer, I mean, how do you assess Ukraine's treatment of the Crimean Tatars from your perspective?
Well, that's a very good question. First of all, the history of how Ukraine has treated Crimean Tatars in the post-Soviet period is quite remarkable. Ukraine did not recognize Crimean Tatars as indigenous people of Crimea and Ukraine before the annexation in 2014. So basically, during this period, 1991 to 2014, Ukraine really wasn't very helpful towards Crimean Tatars and didn't really respond to their concerns and needs on international level nor domestically. And therefore it was quite a surprise for many that it was the Crimean Tatars who were the most loyal group in Crimea to resist to this occupation. So it seems that in this post-Soviet period, Ukraine somehow inherited some of this mistrust or suspicion that the Soviet Union had towards Crimean Tatars, fearing some kind of separatist thinking or I don't know what. It's really a bit of a puzzle as well, because in reality, Crimean Tatars have not been threatening Ukraine's sovereignty at any time, and it became especially obvious in February 2014, exactly 2 years ago, on February 26th, when thousands of Crimean Tatars came out in front of the administration building in Simferopol and really stood up for Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, while Ukraine itself was basically just standing by, looking from a distance, really doing nothing. So.
And I mean, some cynical observers will say that, you know, Ukraine doesn't really care about the interests of the Crimean Tatars, that for them this is just a matter of political convenience.
Well, one is entitled to this opinion, but my hope would be that by finally recognizing Crimean Tatars as indigenous people of Crimea and Ukraine in March 2014, and by officially endorsing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples soon thereafter, that even though these decisions had a kind of this realpolitik background and maybe there was something opportunistic about it, that still this set the foundation for a much better treatment by Ukraine of its own indigenous peoples, that over time will really solidify and build more substance around it. And I somehow think that finally it has sunk into Ukraine that Crimean Tatars are not some kind of a risk or a threat. Crimean Tatars are one of Ukraine's best domestic allies, and it's a natural partnership. Ukraine should not be worrying about Crimean Tatars at some point wanting to secede from Ukraine. No, I think there is a very harmonious coexistence lying ahead, but of course after Crimea has been liberated.
And that sort of brings me to my next question. I mean, after the liberation of Crimea, should it ever happen, a lot of people are saying, or a lot of the Tatar community has sort of called for more autonomy within the Ukrainian state. And it's not entirely clear that the Ukrainian authorities would really want that to occur, especially given all that's happened. I mean, what do you think the future might hold in that perspective? Yeah. It's fine that there will be harmony, but it's not clear what the harmony is going to look like.
Yes. That is the main question. For me, it's not a question of whether Crimea will be returned to Ukraine. It will. The question is when that will happen. Will it happen 2 years from now, or maybe 2 decades from now? On what terms it will happen? And what is the deal, so to say, that Crimean Tatars will get in a liberated Crimea? I'm not going to second guess whether what Ukraine's intentions are towards Crimean Tatars in this liberated Crimea. But my hope is that it will be such that that Crimean Tatars will be able to fully realize their rights as indigenous peoples. And that includes the right to self-determination. In fact, this is the most fundamental of those rights from which other collective rights somehow derive. But right to self-determination means basically that, that Crimean Tatars can suggest their own way of living in Crimea, whether it's a political autonomy, cultural autonomy, whatever the model is. It is not up to Ukraine to say what it is. It is not up to foreign experts to say it. It's up to Crimean Tatars themselves. So they should really collectively agree on it, and then in a way start negotiating with Ukraine. But of course, before that or parallel to that, Crimea has to be liberated.
Sure, and it seems though more and more that in the international community, or rather less and less, people are speaking about the eventual liberation of Crimea. It seems that that's kind of falling from the international stage. People are forgetting about Crimea, and even within the Ukrainian leadership, it's not entirely clear that people are willing to put in the effort to take Crimea back. What does this mean for the Crimean Tatar community and generally for ethnic self-determination, or for the self-determination of indigenous communities around the world, if it turns out that the world really just doesn't care that much about the annexation of Crimea?
Well, I think you're partly right in this, in that indeed soon after Crimea was annexed, then the topic somehow fell off the global headlines, if you will. Maybe also domestic headlines in Ukraine. I wouldn't know. But over the past maybe several months, I have seen an uptick in interest in Crimea and Crimean Tatars. And a very good example of that is the resolution adopted by the European Parliament on February 4th. It's a resolution on human rights situation in Crimea, in particular about Crimean Tatars. And this is a resolution that specifically recognized Crimean Tatars as indigenous people of Crimea. And this is an historic document, because it was for the first time that a major international democratic body really confirmed what Crimean Tatars have been saying for several decades and what Ukraine acknowledged 2 years ago. Now the European Union is on board. And I think we are seeing kind of a global consensus emerging on this issue. And it may be that other major institutions will follow with resolutions analogous to the European Parliament one. And this whole question of whether Crimean Tatars are indigenous or not will be completely off the table. Russia will be alone and lonely in its own thinking that, well, Crimean Tatars are not truly indigenous because A, B, and C. In fact, I'm pretty confident that they are currently working or have been working on this rationale to prove the world that Crimean Tatars are not indigenous, but they will fail in it miserably, unfortunately, fortunately to Crimean Tatars.
So from my side, those are all my questions. Is there a note you'd like to end on, sort of a parting thought you might have?
Well, I would just like to say that, in my view, Crimean Tatars as a people do not have a future under Russia's occupying authority. Crimean Tatars have a future as part of Ukraine that is taking a European vector of development, and that eventually will be part of the European Union. Ukraine that recognizes Crimean Tatars' rights as indigenous peoples, and as part of a European Union that recognizes Crimean Tatars as indigenous people of Ukraine, but also eventually the European Union. That is the future that gives a lot of hope to Crimean Tatars. And in the meantime, I will just hope that Crimean Tatars continue this kind of a non-violent resistance that they have been conducting for the past 2 years, historically even more actually, that I think holds the key to also having this kind of international support for their cause.